Hi everyone, hope everyone's doing well. Okay, I'm gonna start my presentation, and as we all know, my topic is Syria. The topic of Syria is a very wide and broad topic, and it's gonna be almost impossible to be able to tackle all aspects regarding this conflict. Because if we were to do so, we're gonna have to mention the US intervention, Russian intervention, Turkish Syrian war, even ISIS, etc. So my aim here today in this presentation is not this. It is why this war even began in the first place, the core of this war. And if we were to be in class today, I would have asked you why you think this war started. But since we're not in class, I'm gonna directly state my answer, which is political legitimacy. I'm gonna be straightforward about my stand and argument in this presentation. I'm gonna be arguing against the Assad regime and why this war had the wholesome right to occur, and how we must reject the so-called Assad victory in the Middle East today. So we all know about the Arab Springs of in 2011, and we all know that the protests in Syria took place in that uprising. And along with Syria, there were a lot of Arab states having the same protests. They all have different motives, of course, but they were all happening, like in Libya, Yemen, Tunisia, Egypt, and so on. And these protests were like kind of a report card to all the leaders of these countries, like Gaddafi, Ben Ali, Assad, and so on. But the thing is that all those protests reflected back to a main issue, which is political legitimacy, and that all these governments don't derive their legitimacy from the consent of the governed. And this was like a common issue somehow in all these countries. Throughout this presentation, it's very important that I mention that, again, I don't want to focus on the interventions and on the humanitarian aspect even that we all hear about almost every day. I'm here to look into the core of why this all started, if it had the right to start, and today, should it be victory be called upon the Assad regime, or we must reject it, which I say we must in all aspects. I do want to mention though that many Syrians were kind of pissed off when Barack Obama decided to intervene in Syria. But they were not only pissed off because the US is intervening, it was because when the US intervened, it wasn't to put a red line to the Assad government or the regime, it was to fight the Islamic State of ISIS, which was kind of like, let's not say almost, if not equally brutal to the Assad regime, who many believed was the root of the problem. It is the terror of the Syrian leader which kind of allowed room for the terror of the Islamic State. And as we all know, there was a time in 2011 when Syrians were peacefully protesting and asking for simple democratic reforms, and then Assad's forces decided suddenly that they're not going to let this happen, and they violently attacked all civilian demonstrators, and an armed rebel started, and a civil war occurred, and foreign extremists entered the country, religious extremism started, and all hell broke loose. And no matter what Assad did, mass murdering civilians, torturing children, even killing children, and even the killing of the journalist Marie Colvin, I don't know if you heard about it, the US refrained from intervening against the Assad regime or the Assad government. Back to today, Assad's current victory today must be rejected. And to say that Syria is victorious is to say that Syria is a sovereign state with democracy and human rights at its core. And to do so, we need a review of a new legal system, and most importantly, the establishment of free, fair, multi-party elections. Keep the word elections in mind, because this is going to be a highlighted point throughout the whole presentation. Syrians must have the freedom to choose their leadership. And working in the realm of reality and reflecting back to the past, that's why Assad's regime must be rejected today. And personally, I do not believe his self-proclaimed victory can be sustained anyhow today. Why? For several reasons. Number one is that the balance of power has changed today. And the regime's army has shrunk to half the army it even was, less than half actually, the army it even was in the first place. And its resources have been depleted, and many of their supporters have been killed. Second, the acceptance of the Assad survival and the return to the status quo is not only unacceptable to ordinary Syrians, but also can be unacceptable to Americans and Europeans as well. Domestically, the root causes of the war are still present today, economically and politically. But the thing is, now it's even harder to cover these cleavages, knowing that there's a lot of factors that are affecting. For example, the SDF's alliance with the US. This is something very big, wasn't there in the beginning, and now it's here. Also, even though 3/4 of the territories are under the control of the government, yet we still have 3% of the territory in the northwestern Syria unoccupied by the government, and it's still a threat. And this also questions, is the current victory a really won battle, or is it just there for call? Yani? In any country, Syria or not, when we have a legitimate government, we have alternation in power. Kings come and go, prime ministers come and go, presidents come and go. It's never always stable. And if it is, let's say it is, it's out of the consent of the people. They're giving the legitimacy to the power to govern over them. In Syria, this is not present. Since the subject here is Syria, if the consent of the governed is the key to political legitimacy, can the supporters of Bashar al-Assad, Syrian, Iranian, or even Russian, justifiably argue that the system dominated by Assad family and its entourage is or can be legitimate? Can supporters of this regime admit that Syrian state is an authoritarian, predatory family business? Is there consensus that Assad has the right to rule Syria? Will any Syrian claim that his or her consent to this matter has been solicited? And many more questions arise regarding this issue, and this is why I reflect back to elections. Many Syrian civilians are with the regime not because they think it's good or legitimate. It's because they haven't seen any other regime ever since 1970. Can you imagine that? It's like they're brainwashed into thinking this is how it should be, this is how it is, and this is how it should stay. And maybe because they've seen opposing people to the regime being killed, punished, or brutally tortured, maybe nobody knows, and because what guides them is not the hope for this becoming better, it's the fear of dying, because this is just how it is. This is how it's either the regime or nothing. And this is what Assad's regime has proven throughout the years anyway. When the regime chose to respond to protests mainly peaceful and almost entirely non-sectarian in nature, with lethality, this is when all this good hope or goodness of this regime has lost its nice role, you can say. And the Assad regime's total embrace of legitimacy created governance vacuums in wide swaths of Syria. Some of those vacuums were filled by Al-Qaeda or their derivatives. Others were filled by local councils, which enabled Syrians to experience self-governed and civil society. But the regime's relentless war on civilians produced, as it has, millions of displaced, hundreds of thousands of deaths, countless maiming and psychological trauma, tens of thousands of illegal detentions, chemical weapons, let's throw that in there, torture and rape, has rendered any claim or any hope to legitimacy utterly unsustainable and unattainable. Indeed, Bashar al-Assad is not only a bad person, he and his inner circle are subjects for criminal prosecution. Actually, even Iran and Russia can say that they know that Assad's regime is illegitimate. Actually, both those two countries, they suffer from this issue themselves. They have their issue about legitimacy as well. But to show you and to understand how illegitimate this regime is, I'm gonna take you back to elections. I wanted to make this exercise in class actually, and it's so sad that I couldn't. So I was gonna pass on papers. We're gonna be doing elections as a class, and I'm gonna distribute a closed list to choose from, and I'm gonna show you the closed list now. So this is exactly how elections work in Syria. You get to choose any name. Of course, you have a lot of options. They're very diverse, you can say, but this is your only choice. Now, someone please tell me where the fairness is and where the legitimacy lies in this kind of representation in the government. How do people even believe that 99% of the votes go to Assad? I don't know. But some actually do. And this is why you might tell me I'm reflecting too much back on history. I have to focus on what's on today. But we learn from history, and history repeats itself. If we succumb to the victory of Assad today, this is exactly what's going to go back on. This is it, dictatorship. This is exactly what it is. And I don't care if I have the government giving me my education for free. If I can't practice what I'm educated, I can't practice my freedom of speech, my freedom of thought, then what's the use of having the tool that teaches me something that I cannot use? And this is what I'm trying to explain. And the operational question now being parsed by Trump is whether Moscow cares enough about the governance in Syria, extremism in Syria, the future of the Syrian state to consider doing something about crippling illegitimacy of the Assad system, and whether it has leverage to force changes to which the regime and Iran would certainly object. The Russian and the Iranian success in keeping Assad's government afloat cannot be neglected or undermined. This is for sure. And regaining public support must be of most importance to the government to restrict another uprising on the long-term run. But Assad is constrained with opposing alliances, and it's safe to say that it's no longer even Assad's call in anything that happens in Syria. Now he became sort of a puppet to who? To the new government, which is clearly not made even of Syrians, made of outside states, Russia, Iran, maybe US in some way, Europe, let's not undermine the power of Europe itself, and so on, even though it's helping the SDF, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have a hand in anything that goes on under the table. But my question here goes in, is this even better than having the Assad regime on his own? Like, is intervention okay right now? Like, I don't think there's more brutal than the Assad regime, and I don't think it can get any worse than that, personally. I mean, it's been years of inhumanity, if one can say, if not even worse than that, and I don't think it gets worse. And if you look into the situation of Syria today, you can see that the Assad regime is surviving. Yet this is not victory. Victory is only present when this regime is out of power, when Syria is able to breathe again without the fear and dictatorship on how to think and how to choose, to be more exact. I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and I'm open for any questions you have on in the meeting. Thank you.